This describes the Democratic Party and a fair amount of leftists right here. I will let you look at this shitty meme. I tweeted this out a little while ago, and I think this is from a more independent outlet, but the points about this are laid out so beautifully that I think it's an article worth reading in its entirety. The left has given up on COVID. As likely more than 100 million people worldwide have acquired long COVID. We've talked about that before. We don't know what the effects of a COVID infection are going to be 5, 10, 20 years down the line. Length of life, life expectancy, quality of life have taken a sharp downturn in the U.S., where the author of this lives with Black and Latinx populations, losing an average of 4 and 3 years in life expectancy, respectively. Average life expectancy across all demographics is declined a year and a half, sharpest decline since World War II. Deaths have been concentrated in already oppressed populations among Black, Latinx, Indigenous people, and the poor. Agricultural workers die at 2.6 times the rate. Food service workers' death rates were similarly elevated. Older and disabled people continue to make up a large amount of COVID deaths. And the government supported narrative that these people were unwell anyways, something that Walensky said, belies the fact that they would have lived years or decades longer if they didn't get COVID. So this is the context of social murder, a form of heightened class war waged by the rich, right? This is something we need to think about when we are trying to get other people to take COVID seriously again if they stop taking it seriously, or if they never took it seriously in the first place. Really, this piece is an argument to the left. If you're out here preaching hopium, revolutionary rhetoric, advocating for moderate social democratic reforms a la Bernie Sanders, you should be in opposition to the class war being waged against the poor by the rich. And COVID is a tool that the rich are using against the working class of this country. Right? The rich are increasing their profits by forcing poor people to go to work with inadequate protection through multiple ways of infection. And the organized left has failed to show that another pandemic response is possible and that our lives depend on fighting for it. And I would agree with that sentiment. COVID touches everything, and that's why I talk about it so much, because it's so ubiquitous in terms of what it affects, right? It affects your workplace, access to healthcare dictates outcomes, school safety, our ability to care for elders, enjoy elderhood, or just the possibility of having a social life without risking death or debility, right? For people at high risk or severe outcomes, the immunocompromised, anyone over 50, anyone who has high blood pressure, diabetes, higher weight, asthma, depression, participating in social and economic relations has become a daily experiment in chancing death or hospitalization. Meanwhile, the political left in the US and Canada has been curiously restrained in confronting the government's pandemic failures. Ad hoc mutual aid groups sprang up and provided essential relief, but very few unions, nonprofits, or socialist organizations have responded to COVID in a way that reflects its severity and breadth. Leftist groups have continued to organize through campaign frameworks of 2019, foregrounding Medicare for all, student loan forgiveness, climate change, and housing. Those are important issues, but the left's frequent failure to organize against or even name what's distinct about a COVID-mediated social murder during the pandemic has given cover to capitalists and their political parties. And I would agree with that. It allows the capitalists, the ruling masters, the people in positions of power, to say, oh, well, there's clearly no protest to us forcing people back to work, back to class, back to places where they're at elevated risk for COVID, right? And everybody's fine with this. Everybody just wants to get back to normal, don't you? That's what the capitalists are going to be saying. And when you fail to organize against COVID and around it as an issue, you are allowing the capitalists to win. The lack of organization around COVID has allowed the debate over COVID policy to occur between the far right and the center right. Yeah, the Overton window around COVID really focuses around viewpoints from those two demographics. In 2022, the unity between those forces has been realized in the removal of any mask mandates, the end of free testing, and the subordination of public health to corporate profit. Right? Biden campaigned on a promise to contain COVID. He changed course shortly after the vaccine rollout. Right? July 4th, he said we had achieved independence from the virus, and then there was a massive wave right after that. He declared COVID was a pandemic of the unvaccinated, which is not true. He shifted the blame for COVID deaths away from his administration and on to dying people. Vaccinated people were dying as well, but that was downplayed by the CDC. This inaugurated the individual responsibility phase until Up until summer of last year, states had been blamed for COVID deaths. Now it's a personal failure because you didn't protect yourself. Blaming the unvaxxed works rhetorically like blaming immigrants for declining wages. It shifts rightful anger at a miserable state of affairs onto a powerless target and away from our government. And that was a sentiment that was also very common when Walensky herself got COVID, right? When all of the academics rallied to defend her in a giant showing of class solidarity, that was the sentiment that, oh, it's actually your fault. You're not allowed to be angry at her. You're not allowed to say that this is poetic justice based on her policy. You're not allowed to do that. Right, they're shifting the onus onto the powerless. They're punching down. If the vaccine was a carrot, the stick in the US was the end of unemployment benefits. Conservative governors and business owners spent months lobbying against them. These government programs have brought millions of people out of poverty and allowed essential workers to avoid getting sick and prevented deaths. CURB in Canada paid people to stay home so they didn't spread it in the workplace. On the whole, in America, major unions didn't see unemployment as an issue, which is dumb because that's literally what a union's there to do, represent workers. Why would you not protect the jobs of your bargaining unit? Faced with bad options, most people went back to work quietly, even though nothing had been done to make their workplaces safer, such as provision of free N95s, upgrades to air filtration. Those would have been easy and obvious, but measures that would have cost a non-zero amount of money. Yeah, the capitalist government offered workers not genuine safety, but participation in a myth of invulnerability. And in so doing, in pushing to reopen, to declare the end of a harrowing year and return to some form of normal, they encountered little opposition from any part of the political spectrum. COVID safety died with a whimper. One reason the left has struggled to respond to COVID on a national or international scale for a while is left entanglement with capitalist parties, right? Trudeau shut down the dumbass trucker convoy, but within a few months, all provinces' governing parties had ended or scaled back COVID safety measures, more or less capitulating to the convoy. In Canada and the US, major labor unions have been reluctant to criticize the NDP or Democratic Party, despite these parties' abandonment of workers to COVID. In the US, Democrats who were critical of the party's centrist mainstream, such as Bernie or AOC, have been nearly silent on COVID since Biden took office, allowing the administration and Congress to oversee all of this without serious pressure from the progressive or the left flank. Right, during a recent conversation with Ashish Jha, the current White House COVID response coordinator, Bernie began by saying, "We're dealing with COVID fatigue. People are sick and tired of wearing their masks, sick and tired of not being able to go to a restaurant, to a movie theater. What do you say to those people?" Instead of raising the atrocity of over 1 million deaths plus long COVID, the failure to waive vaccine patents, lack of social support, no healthcare, no free testing, and the vax-only approach, he invoked the Biden administration's desired American voter, white, middle-class, able-bodied, without comorbidities, not concerned about their workplace or crumbling infrastructure, but rather tired of wearing a mask and resentful about their consumerism being stymied by public health. Faced with the crises of COVID, perhaps the most common intervention by leftist groups has been to start mutual aid projects, providing food, money, and other essentials to people in need. Kristen Smith, vice chair for programs for the Democratic Socialists of America Disability Working Group, has observed this phenomenon proliferating in the DSA. Groups organizing in and of their own communities to support each other. What that's yielding is very decentralized. It's difficult to share, network, and support between groups. Localized responses have done impressive work in redistributing resources to people in need and trying to, galvanize people to the left in the process. The downside of emphasis on mutual aid is a lack of cohesion and shared struggle at a bigger level. Smith also emphasizes that mutual aid groups' acute care responses have been very stressful, and a deeper reckoning with activist sustainability and collective care will be necessary if they're to continue. Comrades today often fall into the trap of seeing disability and aging as personal problems outside of politics, rugged American individualism, or worse, as personal failures. As Bryn Olson, communications secretary of the Disability Working Group in the DSA, puts it, many comrades see disability issues as idpol, as opposed to issues of liberation. They announced in 2023 their convention. The DSA's National Political Committee announced in 2023 their convention, a biannual event where chapters send delegates to make policy decisions, would be held in person with no virtual option for participation. In response, the Disability Working Group is organizing for a hybrid convention with in-person and virtual options. The recording secretary, Brandon Holt, told me that a hybrid convention not only supports accessibility, but also allows working class people, the base that DSA is supposed to represent and be comprised of, to meaningfully engage. Many workers do not have time off from work or cannot travel for financial, family, or other reasons. Choosing an in-person only convention would exclude many disabled people, and our perspective, and would reflect a classist decision that does not take into account how difficult and time-consuming traveling can be for working-class people. Right? It's troubling that the national body of the DSA, the largest socialist organization in the U.S., doesn't consider participation by their disabled members to be critical for building a movement. But that stance isn't out of step with the practice of leftist groups more generally. They cite a PhD candidate. Okay, I'm not going to talk shit about that. I'm a PhD candidate. It's hard for people to acknowledge they're at risk because of ableism. If they go into it COVID healthy and they come out damaged, they have trouble acknowledging it. This motivates this reluctance to talk about it on the left. If we frame our politics around the solidarity of workers, what do we do about people who can't work? How do we frame that? Textbook leftism is about labor. If we have people who can no longer be laborers, how do we address that? The fetishization of the abled worker renders invisible other members of the working class, sick and disabled people, and people who've aged out of the workforce. Even renders invisible the white male industrial worker as soon as an accident or illness, from a job injury to depression to COVID, takes him out of the factory and into the hospital, the rehab facility, the private home, or the shelter system. When we on the left are trying to advocate for everybody, including working class white people, right? That's a big thing, right? Because the right is very effective at weaponizing identity politics to try and rope in white people on grounds of racism or scapegoating people of color or immigrants for the reason why their material conditions are bad, right? They felt seen and heard and taken care of by that awful fucking rhetoric that ropes them into basically being Nazi foot soldiers if they go deep down the radicalization pipelines enough. But on the left, if we have any hope of bringing those people into the fold, we need to acknowledge that, yeah, white people get COVID too. Their workplaces are as hazardous, if not more hazardous, than any other workplace that we're talking about as a frame of reference, right? We can take their issues seriously too. Ableism is counter-revolutionary. Left failures to incorporate an analysis of disability and ableism are detrimental to our vision and organizing capacity. Capitalism itself is ableist, awarding food and shelter necessary for survival on the basis of how much you can produce, your ability to work for pay. Capitalism ensures its own survival by turning disabled people unable to work, along with the unemployed, into a surplus population whose existence disciplines employed workers into accepting poor working conditions and little pay. AKA, if you don't like your job, there's a million other people who would take it right now, so you better just shut up and keep pulling that lever, lest they fall into the abject poverty and exclusion experienced by disabled and unemployed people. Work under capitalism is a disabling process, as unsafe job sites, injuries from accidents, repetitive stress, mental and psychological tolls, COVID, are all almost universally unsustainable. Activist and writer Harsha Walia, in her book, writes, in contrast to neoliberal framings of disability as exceptional or symptomatic, debility is the quotidian, radicalized biopolitics of working and warring. She shows work and war to be twin methods of disabling a radicalized working class, where people without property are deemed available for injury, either as targets of war and incarceration or as low-wage workers, or both. When we in our organizations fail to make these connections, understanding disability instead as exceptional and apolitical, we limit the horizons of what we can demand. During a pandemic where disabled people are rendered acceptable casualties so capitalism can continue undisturbed. Elite capture within the disability rights movement is one reason why today's left struggles to embrace adequate disability politic. There was a brand of disability activism in the US for a long time that was oriented around neoliberal libertarianism. Disabled people need to get a seat at the table, become employed. It was about seeking representation and inclusion as a way out of institutionalization. They cite whiteness and middle-class character of the disability rights movement, which has emphasized access to employment and education, instead of an overhaul of the racist capitalist system as a key piece of history that informs current left failures to integrate disability and health justice into anti-capitalist organizing. These movements have been siloed. If you care about disability, maybe you're just involved in disability organizing, and you are also separately a leftist organizer. Just in the same way that it's taken the rest of society forever to figure out that disabled people are all around you, the left in the US is playing particular catch-up compared to other countries as a specific result of the brand of activism that helped them win major victories here and the strategies they took to do so. So now this article is getting more laser focused on leftist organizing in the US. Now we have to talk about the unions, right? In contrast with contemporary unions, the early trade unionists in America prioritized disability as a condition of work. There was an early railroad union that started its own long-term care facility to support members who were disabled by losing hands or fingers on the job. The union took workers and their families into this facility they built when the railroad companies abandoned them. The Brotherhood formed not just to protect workers from suffering more injuries, but more to protect their brothers who were being kicked out of their jobs and were destitute and had no recourse. This history illustrates why the distinction between workers and unemployed, disabled, surplus populations is false. How work and disability are intertwined. We are all sick under capitalism, and we are all made sick by work, especially under COVID. Outside of the formal labor movement, too, a left approach that recognizes the centrality of disability to the workings of capitalism is not unprecedented. The Young Lords in the 1970s was an organization that fought for self-determination for Puerto Ricans and colonized people. They occupied a hospital in South Bronx to demand better health care. In 1977, disability rights activists occupied a federal building in San Francisco for almost 30 days, demanding the right to access any service that receives federal funding: hospitals, schools, universities, public transport, government buildings, etc., etc. That sit-in would not have succeeded without the support of the Black Panther Party, the Gay Men's Butterfly Brigade, and United Farm Workers, who provided the occupation with food, security, and personal attendant care. These groups understood that their members had a stake in disability rights whether or not they were disabled themselves. Right, the left needs to unite against pandemic ableism, not out of goodwill or charity, but for the survival of leftism in this country. Organizations limit their membership when they romanticize pre-pandemic organizing practices where everything was in person, and those who couldn't attend due to disability or illness, lack of transportation, work conflict, or family duties couldn't participate. When unions fail to understand or act on that understanding, that scarce poverty-level disability benefits, and the end of the pandemic unemployment supports, these are all political attacks on workers, whose exploitation happens in relation to the parallel misery of unemployment. They miss an important opportunity to build power for the working class. The last few years have been a high point for union organizing. Amazon warehouses, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, we've seen an upswell in logistics, retail, and service sectors. Some of that activity has foregrounded COVID safety, as when in January of this year, the Chicago Teachers Union refused in-person work without adequate protections as the winter Omicron surge erupted. So that's why I brought that up to Shakespeare, because there's precedent for teachers unions making this happen. Those workers organized with an understanding that while they might be well now, the conditions of their work could disable or kill them, and like the government as a whole, their bosses would not prioritize preventing that. So, despite such actions, workplace COVID and health safety measures have been rolled back pretty much everywhere. We've seen the triumph of a capitalist ideology that tells us if we get sick, we should continue to work, and if we die or become disabled, it's our fault. To challenge the ruling class who have made record profits over the pandemic and the political parties who manage affairs for them, we have to organize collective action that builds bridges between workplaces, issues, and identities. We have to work together as teachers, nurses, school staff, retail workers, seniors, disabled people whose lives are increasingly dangerous and isolated, to shut down production and consumption, to demand a public health response that puts life over profit. So to get there, we have to call the pandemic what it is: an exercise in eugenics, a mass disabling event, and an escalation of radicalized class warfare. The left's job is not to accept the narrative that corporate media, the Democratic Party, and government officials like Joe Biden give us, that the pandemic is over, but to craft our own, to show each other how many more people could be kept alive with policies like free healthcare, housing, prison abolition, abolishing borders, nursing homes, mask requirements, vaccine mandates, ventilation upgrades, and widespread accessible testing. We don't need to accept mass infection to survive COVID and all the pandemics that are going to come after this, and trust me, there will be more. We need to recognize that we all have a stake in the system, and transforming it, and we have the power to shut it down. I would rather have workers be united around COVID. And I've tweeted out before. I have absolutely tweeted out before. Some of the Starbucks workers were radicalized by COVID. Some of those Starbucks unions now exist, even if Starbucks is being a cunt when it comes to bargaining. Those worker unions only existed because COVID radicalized them. Again, I would rather have workers withholding their labor and bringing corporations to their knees where their locations are not being properly staffed because they've unionized and they won't bargain with them. Yeah, Nikela, it doesn't matter, because if they're withholding their labor and they're striking because they organized, because they don't want unsafe workplaces because of COVID, among many other reasons, right? They continue to withhold their labor. People aren't going to get their fucking, you know, double mega venti diabetes drink to gallivant into class with at 9 a.m., you know? When people can't get their sugar in this country, yeah, they'll fucking get pissed. Starbucks will suffer a consequence. Shakespeare, you said we have no options. Like they told us we can never ask to work from home again because that was a one-time thing. Yeah, what a feckless fucking union to simply say, oh, well, that was just the boss was being gracious. We have to listen to them. Motherfucker, the entire premise of the union forming was that you did not want to accept the way your boss wants to run your workplace. Show some fucking fight. Have a spine. Fight your fucking boss, proverbially. I mean, working conditions are so bad you actually have to punch your boss. I'm not going to tell you not to, but like, come on. Why does a union exist if it's not going to advocate for its workers? That's pathetic. Loads of people have been radicalized by COVID. Yeah, I mean, the goal is to take that radicalization and make it amount to something. Unions that actually give a fuck about protecting their workplaces. Unions that actually implement COVID safety measures like free masks provided by the boss, air filtration and ventilation improvements in the workplaces that are sustainable for everybody, not just union members, that kind of thing.